Guten Morgen, Fraulein.
Guten Morgen.
¿Cómo estás? Oigo ruido por detrás, sí. Oye, he vuelto de Ucrania, sí. Muy interesante, súper interesante.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good
Um,
afternoon, Daryl.
I trust you're all well.
Mm.
Kirsten, how's Germany? Cold yet?
No, well, it's very warm today. It's 12 centigrade.
Ginza,
It's
Ginza.
Okay.
Vale.
unbelievable.
Pues nada, me podéis invitar cuando queráis.
I just got back from Finland, and they also say
Si queréis esta semana, cualquier noche.
it's a hot winter.
Well, the weather is
Vale.
changing very
Además de
rapidly,
ello,
one
no
day
puedo ir
after
a tu
the
movida
other.
el domingo, porque justo coincide que voy a
Jose,
una
I think
presentación del COP que tengo que
I think your
escuchar porque
mic
si
is
no...
on.
José Luis, te escuchamos
Yeah.
todos.
Let's just give everybody a few more minutes. We've got 21 participants on board at the moment. So let's just give it till about 5 past and then we start. So another 3, 4 minutes and we can get going. For those that have just joined, we're going to start at 5 past just to give people a little bit more time to join, but we'll start at 5 past. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you whom I've not met before, I'm Daryl Swanepoel. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Inclusive Society Institute based here in South Africa. Good to meet all of you. This afternoon is my first time that I'll be chairing these open consultations, Monday consultations that Georges has been leading with such um, professionalism up until now. Thank you very much, Georges. But so please be soft on me. Don't give me too much of a hard time, just in this transition phase. But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for the time that you're putting aside to what I think is an evolving discussion. It's becoming, as we see the globe move to a multilateral order, a multipolar order rather, um, and as certain powers start putting pressure on the developing world, we are starting to see initiatives evolve. And I think this afternoon's topic is therefore timeless and apt, looking at China's Global Governance Initiative. Now, let me just quickly share a screen. Share my screen. There it is. Right. There we are. So the first question is, in sending out the invitation, a number of questions were asked that we're going to discuss this afternoon, and I will attempt to give some response to those questions, and then we open it up for a general discussion. So the first question we asked is China filling a global leadership vacuum, or is it rewriting the rules to suit itself? So in my view, the honest answer is both impulses coexist, and that complexity is precisely what makes the GGI so contested. From China's own perspective, the initiative is a response to a legitimacy crisis in the global system. The core multilateral institutions remained structurally frozen in 1945. The UN Security Council still reflects post-war geopolitics. The Bretton Woods institutions remain weighted towards Western economic powers, and promises of reform have been made for decades but seldom delivered. So even the 2005 World Summit pledge to make the UN Security Council more representative, legitimate, and effective remains stagnant. So China reads the system, I believe, as unreformable from within. And the Global Governance Initiative then is presented as a corrective. It's a bid to fill a leadership vacuum left by the West that demands universality, but refuses to modernize the institutions that would make universality credible. But there's also an undeniable strategic dimension. As Western commentators note, China's creation of new institutions, that's the AIIB, the New Development Bank of BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiatives, and now the GGI linked platforms reflects parallel architecture. In that sense, the GGI both responds to the legitimacy deficit of the current order and leverages it to consolidate China's own influence. However, to interpret this as only as rule writing misses the deeper point. China steps into spaces that others have abandoned. When great powers refuse to evolve institutions, alternatives inevitably emerge. So, looking at the second of the four questions, how are other great powers reacting and what do their reactions reveal? So, their reactions tell us more about their strategic anxieties than about China's intentions. The United States frames the GGI as revisionist and destabilizing, yet it remains the single biggest obstacle to IMF quota reform and has avoided explicit support of concrete Security Council reform models. This contradiction weakens the credibility of the US defense of the rules-based order. Europe shares concerns about China's influence, but is equally protective of institutional privileges, particularly the maintenance of the two permanent Security Council seats for the UK and France. Europe's reluctance to contemplate consolidation reveals the same defensive rigidity of the other China critiques. India, Japan, and the other Asian powers respond ambivalently. They share China's frustration with an unreformed system, but they remain wary of a Sinocentric order. So collectively, I believe that these reactions reveal a deeper truth. Most great powers are less concerned with global governance principles and more concerned with their place in the hierarchy that global governance structures currently preserve. So we look at the third of the fourth questions. How is the rest of the world reacting? Middle powers, global south, global north, civil society, how are they reacting? The global south's response is markedly different from the Western reactions. Completely different. Across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, China's diagnosis actually resonates with them. The existing order is unrepresentative, inconsistent, and often hypocritical. These states do not automatically endorse China's alternatives, but they see the GGI as a rare acknowledgement of their long-standing grievances. For middle powers such as South Africa, Brazil, Turkey, and Indonesia, the GGI is interpreted through pragmatic lens. It represents leverage because competing power centers create room for agency. It represents risk if parallel systems deepens fragmentation. And it represents an opportunity if China's initiatives can be integrated into a broader reform process. Civil society globally is more cautious. Concerns about transparency, accountability, digital sovereignty, and rights-based norms shape skepticism towards China's governance model, but many also critique the West's inconsistent human rights diplomacy and the democratic deficit of global institutions. Western criticisms assumes that leadership is legitimate only when it comes from the West. Yet, for decades, they have partnered with highly authoritarian allies when it served strategic economic interests. This double standard blunts the moral force of their critique, making the global south more open to Chinese proposals. Fourthly, what does this all mean for the future of multilateralism? Multilateralism stands at a crossroads. It's been standing at a crossroads for some time now, not because China is challenging it, but because the existing custodians have failed to reform it. 3 points are essential. First, alternatives arise when institutions fail to adapt. China is not creating a parallel order out of ideological defiance. The vacuum was created by Western resistance to reform. And maybe I'm being a bit harsh on Western resistance because it's also from the East, there's also been resistance to reform the United Nations. Second, the world is now firmly multipolar. No actor, be it China, the US, Europe, or BRICS, can shape global governance alone. Any future system will be layered, plural, and hybrid with overlapping institutions and norms. The question is whether these layers are coordinated or whether they fracture into rivalry. That's the danger. Third, containment strategies will not work. The GGI cannot be wished away because it speaks directly to the structural inequities of the system. What is required is co-reform, integrating parallel initiatives where possible, strengthening global governance standards through engagement rather than exclusion, and accepting that legitimacy is not a Western monopoly. In effect, the GGI is both a critique and a test. Can the world build an inclusive multilateral order, not one that reflects power realities of 1945, but of the 21st century? If the West refuses to evolve, parallelism will deepen. But if reform is embraced, China's initiatives can be incorporated into a broader mosaic of global governance rather than positioned as an external threat. So in conclusion, in closing, China's global governance initiative should not be read simply as a challenge to the system. It is also an indictment of those who have allowed the system to stagnate. The real danger to multilateralism does not come from new initiatives like the GGI. It comes from the paralysis of old institutions and the unwillingness of their stewards to share power. The choice before us is not between a Western order and a Chinese order. The real choice is between a multilateral order that evolves or a fragmented world where multiple systems compete without coordination. And that is not where we want to be. we would prefer a strong multilateral system that works for all, that is just, and that is fair. So those are just some thought-provoking, controversial ideas that I throw out to stimulate the discussion, and the floor is now yours. If you could just indicate to me by show of hand, who would like to start the discussion? I see John. Hi, John. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. Happy to initiate a discussion. Very interesting topic, very clear presentation. Thank you very much, Daryl. So as a question to initiate discussion, what is the relationship in your analysis between the Chinese proposal and democracy oblique accountability, particularly at the global level?
Well, I think we're going to have to start learning, I think, that we're not going to be able to, within the multilateral order, we're not going to be able to synchronize or ensure that everybody follows the same political system. We're going to have to learn to live with different political models. I think the focus should therefore not so much be on the democratic model that is being promoted, but rather on basic human rights, on universal standards, on issues such as that. The argument for democracy versus non-democracy is a valid argument. It's one that us as Democrats want to obviously have promoted strongly, but it's not going to happen in the short term, and therefore we're going to have to learn to accommodate different political models within a multilateral situation.
Can I come back very briefly on that then? At the global level, there needs to be some structure to the way governance occurs. How do you envisage that happening?
You talk about how this new multilateral order is governed, democratic. Yeah, I think it will have to be on the basis of equal strength and on equal participation. So each country that participates in the multilateral order in the specific dispensation will have to have equal say in decisions that are taken. Stephen, and then Georges.
Yes. Well, thank you for that comprehensive presentation. Can we get copies of this? I think it'd be quite useful to have.
We can ask the administrator to send it.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I don't want to necessarily imply anything very different about your conclusions, but I do want to take issue with three of your premises. The first is your premise that the GDI is not ideological. I would rather dispute that. I mean, I think you're giving the Chinese a free pass when it comes to their intentions. I am somewhat, I mean, while I applaud a lot of the practical things that the Chinese have done in many parts of the developing world, their motivations, I would say, are not purely developmental or not purely selfless. My second contention is and I quote you here, you say legitimacy is not a Western monopoly. That must be mistaken, because legitimacy is surely a universal concept. And, if we can't agree about the degree to which, or perhaps whether or not a government is representative and legitimate, then I think we have a very difficult path to multilateralism today or tomorrow. I mean, I actually do believe that the thing that is undermining the UN and multilateralism in general, almost more than anything else, is the question of legitimacy. Sovereignty is one thing, but sovereignty without legitimacy is an invalid basis for multilateralism. That's really what I'm saying. And then the other thing I would have some issue with is your point about multipolarity. Politically, yes. Financially, absolutely not. It's a unipolar world. It's still completely dominated by the dollar and the American-based financial institutions, including those in Washington and New York, the SWIFT system, and so on. I mean, every way you look at it, the dollar, unless it's going to be dethroned in the next coming years, which is a real possibility, I would say that in financial terms, it's a unipolar world, which is why, the Americans get away with a good deal simply by using their financial leverage. So those are 3 points I would cast some doubts on, or needing further clarification, perhaps, while I don't necessarily dispute your desires for what should come next. Thanks.
Sure, thank you for that. And in terms of ideology, what the actual point I'm trying to make there is that a vacuum has been created because of a lack of reform in the United Nations. And because of that vacuum that has been created, China has now seen an opportunity in which they can advance their national interests. I don't think we should be under any doubt that China is doing this as a philanthropic do-gooder or anything like that. They are doing it to advance their national interests, not necessarily their ideology, not necessarily the Chinese model, the Chinese system with, what they say, market with Chinese characteristics. They're not necessarily promoting that ideological position. But sure, they are obviously wanting to promote the national interest. But isn't that something that all countries are supposed to do? The fact of the matter is that we have created an opportunity, a vacuum that allows for alternatives to start taking shape. If there was if reform was embraced more passionately within the United Nations, that vacuum would never have been created, and we would not be sitting with this situation that we're sitting with now. In terms of the dollar, yes, I've written another paper in which I make that very point, where that is where the United States hold real power. That is, everything evolves around that, but that's also starting to evade. I mean, if you look at within the BRICS Confederation, they are now putting a new alternative to a payment system in place where you can bypass the dollar. And the point that I make in that paper is that you don't have to dethrone the dollar. You just simply need to start using it less. And what we are now seeing is within the BRICS configuration, people are no longer paying, or not to the same extent, increasingly abandoning settlement through the dollar system, but doing direct transactions. In South Africa, for example, we now settle directly in renminbi or in South African rand. We don't settle via the dollar anymore. But for the time being, that is where the United States hold the real power. In terms of legitimacy, well, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think legitimacy is a universal concept, but at the end of the day, legitimacy need not be defined purely by the West. Legitimacy can also have other flavors to it, and therefore I don't think that that there is a single definition for whether a country is legitimate or not. I think if you're upholding the standards that have been set out in the charter, then you should be considered legitimate. I'm not too sure about that one, to be honest with you. Georgios, and then Henk Jan.
Yes, thanks, Daryl, and good to be here with you, Jarin, and good start. And thanks for the friends for being continuing to be part of it and even increasing their participation. I'm very glad about that. But to speak to the substance of what we're discussing today, legitimacy is not the preserve of the West, and the same goes for the international community, I think. All this, we believe, we say it and we believe it eventually too much here in Europe, in North America, that the international community won't allow that, or that goes against the international community, thinking that we, like by birthright, we represent it. And the international community is something much bigger. And if you talk about population terms, etc., certainly the 1 billion, how many people the West may have, the expanded West, does not speak on behalf of the total 8 billion of people. So we have to be certainly open and aware and trying to also bring in others to share also the burden, because reforming the multilateral system is not only a prerogative, but it is also a big burden to follow up on it. And I'm not sure how much staying power the Chinese have when they come up with these initiatives, whether they would pursue it, because I've seen the US pursuing in 2005 the World Summit then some elements of UN reform, and even before that, in the 80s and 90s, cutting money, coordinating everything to get what they want. That I don't know if I want to see it from the Chinese exactly the same way, or if the Chinese really want to promote these principles. And in case you don't remember these principles, they were about sovereignty, about having impact, about people-centered policies. The five principles were, to me, consistent to the charter. How would they mean it? I don't know. Perhaps you can tell us more to implement it in a UN reform. That would be interesting. Uh, but in terms of rhetoric, they sound quite consistent to the charter, and also whether they would really insist. And I think we do need a co-ownership of the UN. We see these spheres of influence being created and openly talked about by the US administration recently, their Western Hemisphere. They talk to Russia, they talk to the Chinese. So we have a kind of Yalta these days. Can they agree also on a new multilateralism? Would a fourth and the fifth element, middle powers, Europe, come in to co-shape this? I don't think that would be necessarily bad, because if we think that the West has a let's say, monopoly in legitimacy, I think we just don't see what's going on in front of us within our own countries, in the US and elsewhere. So, and what's going outside our own countries with genocidal actions, with crimes, war crimes, etc. In the UK also there is this discussion Afghanistan, or the US what is doing extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean. Not to mention anymore because I've taken too much time. Thanks.
No, thank you very much for that, Georges. I think I haven't actually read much about the tactics and the strategy as to how they actually want to promote it, the Global Governance Initiative through through the UN system. I haven't read any papers on that. But what I am sensing is that they are setting themselves up for shifting. If reform does not take place, then a lot of the decisions that are currently taken by the United Nations will systematically start shifting to all other forums. If you look at BRICS, for example, BRICS was initially set up as a economic bloc. And this has systematically over the years changed to people coordination, to working together on multilateral reform, looking at peace and security issues, looking at development. So systematically, they have usurped more and more of the discussion that normally would take place in the United Nations. They started to have these discussions within BRICS or within the Belt and Road initiatives, etc. So that has systematically been taking place. The trigger for whether we will actually shift to a multilateral order or not lies in the day that BRICS or the Belt and Road get a secretariat, that is the day that we know that we will start shifting towards the multilateral order. At the moment, it's a network, it's a club. There's no consistency or continuity in the drive. But as soon as they take that decision, okay, we've waited long enough for reform, we are now going to start setting up more organization and put a secretariat in place, then we know we are firmly en route to a multilateral order. Henk Jan rather, Henk Jan.
Thanks so much. This is really great and great to see you all. I want to make a couple of points reacting to what you said and what Stephen said. On your last point, the Chinese have pushed for some references to their various initiatives, including the Bridge and Road Initiative and also the Global Development Initiative, in resolutions in the UN. So they really are trying to push this at the global level. Also in terms of what you just said there is not a vacuum in the UN. I don't think there is a vacuum at all. There is a very strong relative growth of the power of developing countries. I started in the UN before the Berlin Wall came down, and surely at that time, the UN was dominated by the Western world, Europe and North America. That's absolutely not the case anymore. The countries that have really a significant amount of power, such as India, Brazil, and South Africa, and Egypt, India, they really are putting, and exercising their power. And China is among them very clearly, and certainly over the last 10 years in all kinds of areas, not only in trying to get JPOs in the UN system, to get USG positions in the UN system, but also in the way they exercise their power that they have in the Security Council, and not always hiding behind Russia, and in peacekeeping. They have really increased the number of peacekeepers, and therefore also having a much bigger say about what's happening in peacekeeping. So I think we are already moving to a multipolar world, and we have been moving to a multipolar world for decades. It's slowly, and it's happening. And as the ESG said, sometimes that's chaos, and it's not a balanced system, because it's not that easy to balance as a bipolar world or a unipolar world. But as the SG also says, we need a very much more stronger multilateral system if we have a multipolar world. And he compares it to the 19th century, when we had a multipolar world, and it led to all kinds of terrible world wars. I don't want to make that parallel, but I do agree that we need a strong multilateral system. And in that sense, I think a lot of the emerging powers are fully in agreement, is that we need a strong multilateral system based on international law. And I'm not sure, Daryl, I heard you used the words international law, although you did just mention the UN Charter. The international law based on the UN Charter. And Russia and China and India and Brazil all agree with that, on top of 150, 160, 170 other member states of the UN. What they disagree with is the phrase that has been used, the rules-based international order. And they have really attacked that as a Western invention. I'm not always sure I completely understand what they're saying, but they argue that it is based on rules that the West wrote towards their advantage, and I think to a certain extent that's true. I can definitely see that. But of course, now and they have been doing that, the BRICS and others. It's their turn, and it's to have a seat at the table, and they have been doing that at the UN. There is nothing that can pass, anymore without having a strong voice of developing countries and a strong agreement of developing countries at the UN. Of course, you're absolutely right on Security Council reform, but I don't think it's Western countries necessarily that are holding it up. what is holding it up is a disagreement among developing countries of, do we need more permanent seats in the Security Council, or do we just have a new category of countries that creates, re-electable seats and seats that you can get elected for 8 or 9 or 10 years and get re-elected immediately again. And the big controversy is there between the G4, Brazil, India, um, Japan, and Germany, versus the coffee club, uniting for consensus. You can imagine the exact opposite of, it's Italy, Argentina, etc., who are against permanent seats in principle, because of the equality of sovereignty of nations, but also against, of course, the permanent seats of these specific 4 countries. And that is holding it up. And only that. I do think that there might be a problem with the ratification of the change in the charter that is necessary. And I don't see, certainly not under this administration, that the P5, all P5 countries have to ratify it. And you might guess which country I have some doubts about at the moment. Although I don't know exactly what would happen in Russia either. Russia has been one of the strongest defenders of the prerogative of the Security Council, and any inroads on the power of the Security Council, including, for example, through the Peacebuilding Commission, is something that Russia is very much against, and not the Western countries. So I think one point about the unipolar economic world. There is no unipolar economic world anymore. Despite the fact the dominance of the dollar is fast declining. It's still the dominant currency, absolutely, but it's been declining over the last few decades. China is by far the biggest economy at the moment, if you look at it in purchasing power parities. I saw the statistics the other day that 85% of the world's manufacturing goods are made in China. That seems a little bit higher. I have to double check that. But it's not surprising I wouldn't be surprised. It's shocking, but not surprised if that would be true. Manufacturing quickly shifting to India as well. I really, but the one thing that you did mention, Daryl, about the payment system in BRICS, I think it really would be detrimental if we have different systems developing. So you can have a huge rise in the power of BRICS countries and other developing countries with still having one payment system, or and that shouldn't be based on the dollar. I totally agree with that. The U.S. should not have a monopoly on reforms in the IMF and the World Bank. They need to be more seats for developing countries. And they do have now, because it requires 85% of the votes to change the voting power, for example, and the US has 17%. I think I leave it here. I talk too much, but really fascinating discussion. And thanks so much, Daryl, for your introduction. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Enkjan. And that input, I think, was very, very valuable, and it brought different angles to the discussion, which is really worth interrogating. But you spoke about international law. I didn't mention that. You're quite right. But as a South African, given the stance that we've taken on, for example, the ICJ, we would be strong proponents, and I believe you are right when you say that the developing world are strong proponents of looking at international law, at adhering to international law. On the rules based, the concern that and that you often hear that discussion in African discussions about UN reform, it's rules based order. Then the question comes, whose rules? So we're talking about a rules-based order, but whose rules? Who's writing those rules? And that's where the concern is. They feel excluded from writing the rules, and that's why the impression is created, rightly or wrongly, but the impression is created, we have to listen to what the West is dictating to us. You're also right when you say that what is holding up the process is, well, you are partially right, I would say. when you say it's a developing world that can't decide which system is to be followed, that is holding up reform. There, I differ with you slightly, but I also agree with you. I agree with you, for example, in the African situation, we have a very clear position. We want 2 members on the Security Council. But I often ask the question, which 2 countries?
Exactly.
Which 2 countries? Is South Africa and Egypt going to find favor with Nigeria and Kenya? There becomes a
Exactly.
problem. And that is why I think Kirsten was part of that discussion, maybe you too as well, when I put the position on that. Maybe we should move away from expanding the Security Council by numbers of countries and start accommodating regional unions
Mhm.
on the Security Council. The EU, the AU, ASEAN. I know there's charter changes, etc., that will be needed for that, but that can be done. But where I disagree with you is that, and specifically with with the Security Council, I cannot see. I think it's a pipe dream to think that any of the P5 are going to willingly give up their veto right. They're not going to do that, and that is
Oh,
and that is that is the biggest
I,
obstacle
yeah,
to reform. So there, even I'm saying that
yeah.
we should stop talking about reforming the Security Council by getting rid of the veto power. It's not going to happen. Let's
No,
rather start an approach of saying, how do we manage that veto? What rules can we write to make it more
exactly.
palatable?
Uh,
Like building in,
yeah,
conflict of interest rules,
yeah,
or
yeah,
building in appeal mechanisms that come back for discussion.
exactly.
You need to write
Ex-
rules around it. That's what I'm saying.
yeah, totally.
Um,
Totally in
yeah,
agreement.
yeah, I think that in a nutshell sort of responds. Kirsten, over to you. What I'd like to see from the rest of the audience now is not necessarily an interrogation of what I said, but how you interpret, like Henk Jan has just done as well. I think that interpretation helps us advance the discussion somewhat. Kirsten, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to take us back to the substance of our discussion, namely the Chinese Global Governance Initiative. And your first question, I would say both parts can be answered with yes. Yes, China is filling a vacuum and it's serving its interest. But I would interpret it serving its interest slightly differently from you, in the sense that China can only do it and its own thinking only within the tradition of its own state political culture. And that's why I think, in fact, that the India and Japan reaction to it is the healthiest of them all. They say, yes, there is a need, there is a vacuum, and we have to fill it. But please, I mean, we don't want a Sinocentric global governance system. But that is where we have to engage with the Chinese. That in fact, when they say multilateralism eventually is about coordination of what the various poles in a multipolar world do. Yeah, but how? And who? And would they have an enforcement capability? The Chinese default thinking is, no, we will have to build a strong United Nations, and they will just be able to control these various polar actions, and in particular when it becomes too messy, when it becomes too chaotic, and so on. So, but that is in fact where we have to engage. That's where we have to discuss, because we need more than just reform the system. I think we have to go back to say, what is the function of a multilateral system? And then what institutions do we need for that? And what tools would we have to put at their disposal? And then, yes, how much of national sovereignty would we surrender in order for the global system to continue to function smoothly and in harmony, and how the Chinese always call it. And that is the biggest challenge. And we have to guard ourselves from projecting into the Chinese initiative something that isn't there. For instance, the Chinese don't have a strategy or promotion program at this moment, like the US would be doing it. They have thrown it out, and they're testing now the water. They have invited everybody to comment on it. And I'm sure they have had plenty of comments from various quarters, and they are now working through their way in order to see, so where is this all going? In which direction is it going? In the meantime, they try to stabilize the existing system by putting Chinese at strategic important positions. And then one last point, international law, as we know it today, is for the Chinese of no importance. And I mean, I can give plenty of examples for that. So let's just be very clear. This is a political initiative. This needs a political answer, but it should be one of dialogue, of being engaged, of trying that new ground, to find that new ground that we need for the world in the 21st century. And because what is hidden in the Chinese proposal is clearly not what the rest of the world wants. But at the same time, the rest of the world hasn't as yet either said what it is that they want. You know, they have only said, and no, this won't work and that won't work, and so on. So I personally think let's take it as an opportunity to truly advance the discussion with the Chinese and with other countries, and see, so what comes out as a possible consensus, and how far can we evolve the system so that indeed the multilateral system is sort of the chapeau, and it makes sure that things stay in balance, that we do not only have globalization for trade and investment, but we have globalization also for sustainable development. We have global development and globalization for social justice, and so on. And that needs different tools and different mechanisms than trade and investment. And that is, I think, where we need to engage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kirsten. In fact, there's very little that I actually differ with you. I agree with you. But as I also said and you referred to it, we've got the broad principle, the idea, but we haven't got the tools and the mechanisms. That hasn't been set up yet. And I've done very little reading. I've seen very few documents talking about how they're actually going to advance this process within the UN, etc. And maybe for a future discussion at some point, we can maybe engage some scholars of China to ask them now, okay, you've got this global governance initiative that's on the table. How are you going to advance this? Tell us a bit, and how are you going to get universal standards and universal buy-in to the system? I think that will also make a very good discussion going forward.
Absolutely.
On international law, I don't necessarily disagree with you, except to say that it's not the Chinese that ignore international law. It's not just the Chinese that do not hold it in very high esteem. Some Western powers, if you look at, for example, United States, they just rubbish international.
I just wanted to say, don't put your hope on the Chinese to challenge that double standard. They won't.
Don't put your hope in anybody. You need to stand up for. But the principle is that the developing world, in the main, believe in international law, and they believe in international law also because it suits them. Also, it suits them, and you would also find that they are all for international law when it's going to benefit them. But if it's going to turn against them, then they don't want to be part of it. You look at the ICJ. Everybody signed up to the ICJ, including this country at one point, South Africa. When there was a ruling going against us, what did we do? We wanted to withdraw from the ICJ. thank goodness we did it. We stayed in it, and it's now working in our favor. So I think that international law story is everybody actually looks at it through their lens as to what is in their interest. But thank you very much for that, Kirsten. I think that's enriched this discussion quite a lot, and we'll take that.
Unfortunately, I have to leave, but thanks for the discussion and thanks for the opportunity to make my contribution.
No, good to see you again. Jan?
Yes,
John,
thank
I've
you very
noted you, but we'll get Jan across.
thank you very much. I'm based here in Costa Rica, and I'd like to continue the dialogue on international law. Yes, lots of rejection, but we all need it. We all need some form of it. And I have been linked to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for the past 15 years. And I see changes within this court, more interest in doing training and outreach and getting into the countries. And I think traditionally, the courts, the international courts in the world, have sort of assumed an attitude, a psychological attitude of being removed and recluse. But now, and I've put into the chat a meeting that was held last month here, but connected to the Council of Europe, looking at the challenges for democracy in states for the rule of law. So I think there's a resource that needs to be explored in terms of the system of international courts that we have and the very brilliant and courageous people who work there and who perhaps have been trained not to interact in fora like this one, but we need them and they need us. And so that's what I wanted to add to this discussion as a way that we can join together and build something new, which is what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think you brought a new angle there because I've actually seen very few discussions taking place as to how the international law system can help bring about development and multilateralism, etc. And peace and security. We need to start raising those questions as well as using the international law as a tool to advance development.
Yeah,
John?
right. I think, excuse me,
No,
I
please.
came from another inter-American agency, the one specialized in agriculture, where I spent 30 years. And then I went into this connection with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And so now I've been at it for what, 40 years, thinking about these connections. And I really think that we need to build bridges. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. John?
I have an ignorant question. Just wondering if anyone on the call is engaged in discussion with the Chinese about their global governance initiative.
I superficially, but we've got a date early next year to put this on the agenda. I am busy talking to one of the universities in China. There's Zhejiang Normal University and through the Institute of African Studies, where we have raised the issue a month ago or so at one of our seminars about the Global Governance Initiative, and we set a date for early the new year to get a greater understanding of what is meant by it and its implementation roadway. Following that, I think we could then maybe get them to engage in a discussion such as this as well. But I don't know if there's anybody else talking to the Chinese. Not. I think it's actually what I think I'm picking up from this meeting. It's actually very important that we actually engage the Chinese directly, because you have the situation where we're talking about, but we're not talking to. we're talking about the Chinese, but we're not talking to the Chinese. And maybe it will strengthen our arsenal if we talk to the Chinese directly. And I think that's something we should set up in due course.
From my perspective, very briefly, I mean, it really doesn't matter to me if it's the Chinese, the Americans, the South, the West. I don't care who it is. But from humanity's perspective, we really do need to sort out global governance pretty urgently. And so I would be all for engagement.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we know we know we always talk about America will not give up its vote on the Security Council, but we tend to forget that China will also not want to give it up. I mean, there's no angels in this. There's only interests, and that's what we need to engage upon. Georges.
Yes. Thanks, Daryl. Okay, there are no angels, but some people have suffered more. And so, in a way, we support that part of the world to bring a balance. But as you said, even for developing countries, it is again their interest, right? So, yeah, we keep that in mind. But who are we? I want also to ask Kirsten when she says we have to engage the Chinese. We all say that as if the UN is another independent thing, or we think as civil society. I don't know who. That's humanity, but who represents that, right? So there are other elements. The countries and the interests, the economic interests are there. They are using us also as individuals, but it's a way to organize ourselves. So we take that and we try to regulate it. Again, the who is not very specific, but it's been regulated through a system that at least does not leave too many bodies, dead bodies behind, ideally, if we don't go to war and we don't get starvation, etc. But if you don't have a UN that works including its secretariat or the Secretary General, which is supposed to be the body that is not based on sovereignty and national interest or regional interest, and if you have a civil society that's also, I think, fragmented, meaning that those who claim to be civil society now are mostly from the West because we were also there ourselves. Good intentions, but not representative, again, not even of the grassroots of the West. It's more like think tank and people with some money and some interest in all this. So, how can we indeed engage more others as a common problem solving exercise to see what we can do with the multilateral system? And I would recommend that perhaps for next events like this, we invite the UN Association of China. I think they are open to discussing, right? Like the UN Association of the UK, they are among the leads in this one for 8 billion campaign for the new Secretary General. And that's another area that we could see how there can be some convergence of both interests and more refined perhaps wishes of humanity to so in yeah it would be good to identify such actors, invite them and try to have a broader discussion indeed. Thanks.
Georges, you've put a complex problem on the table that is above my pay grade, and I would suspect above most of our pay grade is how do you get civil society? Who is civil society? And how do you get a coordination between civil society? And how do you get a common position among civil society? I believe that's almost impossible task to do. And I speak from the South African situation where we've got a national dialogue taking place where civil society are talking to each other as if it's civil society standing up against the government. But then I ask them, do we agree on immigration, how to deal with immigration? And there are those that want to kick all the immigrants out of the country, and others that want to embrace international law and human rights conventions, etc., etc. There is absolutely no agreement. If you look, there are people in the country that are wanting the death penalty to be reinstated, and others that saying under no circumstances are we going to reinstate. Civil society is so divided. I think we have to understand that we'll never get civil society to pull in unison. All we can do is understand what the different positions are within civil society and then decide which civil society organizations are those that we can work with and which civil societies we have to compete with. But your practical suggestions we take on board, and I think there's some ideas about discussions for the next one or two, but maybe towards March or so, we can reopen this discussion on the Global Government Initiative, but from a different angle this time, from what does it really mean, how do they see it, and how do they want to promote it going forward. John, you again?
Sorry.
No,
I,
please.
I can offer to support exploring Georges's idea of UNA associations. I know Alan Wyatt's done a lot of work with the World Federation of UNA associations around the world, and I know Alan has sent specific emails to the Chinese within that organization to get things approved by WFUNA. And Dorothea Christiana is someone else I work with, is within UNA UK, so I can offer to support exploring the possibility of that follow-up.
No, thank you very much for that. Let's agree that we will set something up in the near future, and then we get 2 or 3 Chinese institutions or academics or so to make to talk to the question, and we can interrogate that. We'll take you up on that one. Thank you very much, John. Right. Any further contributions? I don't see any more hands up. I'm going to play auctioneer now and say going, gone. For speak up or forever hold your peace. How's the saying go? All right. I think that is that has been let's call it a day. I think it's been a very useful discussion. I think we'll bring a report out of this, and I think we'll get a lot of more questions than answers. But I think also some direction is coming out of it. So I want to thank you all for that contribution. And Georges, I don't know if you want to say anything before we close in terms of possible topics going forward.
I think we have a slide for the next one, but Daryl is now again in your team that the initiative lies. So yeah, here it is. Manan put it, and the registration link is ISI registration link, no more a FOGS link, and that really cements the transition. Right. Manan is putting it up. Here it is. What is the future of the G20? A question that we all have after the non-invitation or de-invitation of South Africa by the US and the invitation of Poland, I understand, perhaps to replace South Africa. And how is this G20 process going to proceed? Is South Africa going to be part of the T20 and the B20, but not the summit of G20? And yeah, does G20 have a meaning when the 3 topics that the US has chosen are very self-serving? And I can send you an article of mine that was just published. I mean, yeah, I don't know how the world and all of us will engage with this G20 as it's now been reshaped by the US. So I hope there is interest in discussing it. Thanks, Daryl.
I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion, and it's going to be very interesting over the next while to see how the other participants of the G20 whether they are willing to take a stand or not, because it would be a sad day for multilateralism if one country can, because they are now in the chair, if one country can decide who to expel and who not to expel without discussing it with other people, with other countries, participants, and if these other countries are just going to accept what that chair or what that current president says or not, or are they going to get some backbone and say something about it? That's going to be a very interesting couple of months that lie ahead there. In terms of the T20, I'm part of the T20, and so far as I know, the T20 continues. So at least the T20 and the B20 will be continuing as normal, but let's see what happens about the G20. I don't think we've seen the end of that discussion yet. thank you everybody for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you at the next consultation.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Enjoy the holidays in the meantime. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take care.